What can you say about Frank Bidart? No, seriously. What the heck can you say about Frank? What claim can be made with any degree of certainty about a poet whose very nature is that of a shapeshifter, a beguiler, a thrower of voices, a wearer of masks? A writer who demonstrates time and again the mysterious imperative of the speaker to shape perception, to impersonate, to embody. A poet whose essential theme is the intractability of identity, and who, in his relentless engagement with the enigma of the self, resembles the god Janus, looking forward to the prosody of opacity and fragmentation carried by the afterwash of postmodernism into the 21st century, and backwards to the wellspring of high modernist ventriloquisms of the cantos and the wasteland. For surely we might say of Frank, quoting T.S. Eliot, that he do the police in different voices. And if, having now brought the police into our investigation, if this were an episode of Law and Order, Frank's favorite TV show, it might begin by examining the suspect's testimony on his own behalf. To wit, I enter into evidence the poem Borges and I, one of Frank's most self-reflective meditations, a poem that occupies a position in Frank's work analogous to the one that self-reflection in a convex mirror fills within the oeuvre of John Ashbery. I quote, "The notion that Frank has a self that has remained the same and that knows what it would be if its writing self did not exist, like all assertions about the systems that hold sway beneath the moon, the opposite of this seems to me to be true as true." Aha! So the nature of the self, to paraphrase, is defined by the act of making art. I create, therefore I am. And also, as I create, so am I changed. So do I become a new self. Or so asserts the speaker of this poem, a narrator suspiciously named Frank, discussing a subject who goes by the very same name. But are we sure that this is the real Frank Bidart? Is it not more likely in such a poem to be a doppelganger, a literary construct, a Borgesian impostor? I call to the stand a second witness. From the poem, Ulanova at 46 at last dances before a camera Giselle, in which is first revealed to the 18-year-old narrator the severity and ferocity at the root of classic art. Ulanova came to Pomona, California in 1957 as light projected on a screen to make me, early in college, see what art is. Frank writes, tracing the origin of his fatal attraction to this filmed performance of the ballerina Galina Ulanova. Pomona, 1957, early in college. The biographical evidence fits the profile of our suspect. Aesthetically, likewise, severe, ferocious, corrosive, self-questioning, self-implicating. Are these not the poetic hallmarks of the poetry of Frank Bidart, as we have come to know it over nearly 40 years of distinguished publication? And then we have the ballet itself, the subject of this poem, a smoking gun if ever there were. If art is the treasure chest within which Frank's heart beats, surely ballet is the key that would unlock it. When the Ballet Russe premiered the Ballet Parade in Paris during World War I, Diaghilev produced, from choreography by Massin. Erik Satie composed the score, Picasso painted the scenery and designed the Cubist costumes, and Apollinaire, in his program notes, coined the term surrealism to describe its avant-garde aesthetics. But when Frank wrote the long poem, The War of Václav Nijinsky, he not only filled each and every one of those roles himself, he even managed to coax Nijinsky onto stage to dance, something Diaghilev had failed to accomplish in 1917. And as we think back to Frank's brilliant illumination of Nijinsky's schizophrenic genius, we are reminded of some of his other memorable impersonations: the doomed anorexic Ellen West, the murderous sociopath Herbert White, the Roman historian Tacitus recounting the destruction of Varus's legions in the dark Germanic forest. And we conclude that Frank is not drawn to easy marks, bit parts, soft targets. And in regard to his fondness for difficult characters, we might recall Frank's role as amanuensis to both Robert Lowell and Elizabeth Bishop, and so recognize his unrivaled position of literary intimacy, his status as privileged listener to American poetry's internal monologue. We might begin to suspect that there is no one else quite like Frank in our poetry, that he is an idiosyncratic original, a St. Francis of Assisi of poetry land. If St. Francis had been born in Bakersfield, California in 1939. Certainly I, for one, believe that Frank could charm the birds into listening as he preached, if he had any interest in preaching or birds, which he does not. And we might consider further Frank's roots in that agricultural outback of California, growing up in a community of Basque descent, an immigrant identity so benighted, he recalls, that no one even makes ethnic jokes about them. Did you hear the one about the two Basque shepherds who walk into the bar? No, neither did Frank. And yet it must be noted that even as Frank rejected the agricultural heritage of Bakersfield, he displayed precocious skill as a farmer, transplanting himself to the mineral-rich soil and poetically enhanced microclimate of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where indeed his vineyards have proven fruitful. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I propose to you that there is a real Frank Bidart, that he is neither saint nor sociopath, though he may speak as either. I propose to you further that however he chooses to speak when he comes before us tonight, it behooves us to listen with utmost attention. For just as the wavering image of a Russian dancer on a movie screen in California revealed to him the nature of his task, so Frank Bidart's poems perform an irreplaceable act of aesthetic empowerment for us. They make us see what art is.
Thank you, Campbell. How can one follow an introduction like that? Such a brilliant piece of virtuosity and conjuring. Would that I could conjure the same person that you do. I'm going to read a number of lyrics tonight. One poem that's 4 pages. Mostly there'll be 1 or 2 pages. The book I'm working on is called Hunger for the Absolute, and that, I hope, will be present as a theme throughout. On this earth where no secure foothold is. Wanting to be a movie star, like Dean Stockwell or Gigi Perot, answering an ad at 10 or 11. You made your mother drive you to Hollywood and had expensive Hollywood pictures taken. Hollywood wasn't buying. Everyone is buying, but not everyone wants to buy you. You see the kids watching, brooding, religion, politics, love, work, sex, each enthrallment, each enthusiasm presenting itself as pleasure or necessity is recruitment. Each kid is at the edge of a sea. At each kid's feet, multitudinous voices say, I will buy you if you buy me. Who do you want to be bought by? The child learns this is the question almost immediately. Mother? Father? Both mother and father tried to enlist you, but soon you learned that you couldn't enlist on both sides at the same time. They lied that you could, but they were at war. And soon you learned you couldn't. How glamorous they were. As they aged, they mourned that to buyers they had become invisible. Both of them in the end saw beneath them only abyss. You are at the edge of a sea. You want to buy, but you know not everyone wants to buy you. Each enthrallment is recruitment. Your body will be added to the bodies that piled up make the structures of the world. Your body will be erased, swallowed. Who do you want to be swallowed by? It's almost the same question as to be or not to be. Figuring out who they want to be bought by is what all the kids with brooding looks on their face are brooding about. Your weapon is your mind. History. For 2 years, my father chose to live at the Bakersfield Inn, which called itself the largest motel in the world. There, surrounded by metal furniture painted to look like wood, I told him that I wanted to be a priest, a Trappist. He asked how I could live without pussy. He asked this earnestly. This confession of what he perceived as need was generous. I could not tell him. Sex shouldn't be part of marriage. Your father and I, sex shouldn't be part of marriage. That she loved and continued to love him alone, and he her, even after marrying others. Then they got old and stopped talking this way. Ecstasy in your surrender to adolescent God hunger. Ecstasy promised by obliterated sex. Ecstasy in which you are free because bound. In which you call the God who made what must be obliterated in you love. Chaos of love. Chaos of sex that marriage did not solve or mask. God did not solve or mask. Grant and Hepburn in Bringing Up Baby, in which Grant finally realizes being with her is more fun than anything. What they left behind broken. The fiction even they accepted, even they believed, was that once it was whole. Once it was whole, left all who swallowed it, however skeptical, forever hungry. The generation that followed, just like their famished parents, fell in love with the fiction. They smeared shit all over their inheritance because it was broken, because they fell in love with it. But I had found my work. Name the bed. Screams stretched across it. Someone wanted more from that bed than was found there. Name the bed that's not true of. Bed where your twin died. Eraser bed. Those nights. Those nights when, despite his exhaustion or indifference, you persisted. Then finally, it caught, so that at last he too wanted it, suddenly was desperate to reach it. You felt his muscles want it more than anything. As if through this chaos, this wilderness, he again knew the one thing he must reach. Though later, after he found it, his resentment implied he'd been forced. Those nights ended because what was missing could never be by the will supplied. We who could get somewhere through words, through sex, could not. I was, you said, your shrink. That's how I held you. I failed as my own. Now you surely are dead. I've searched the databases. You everywhere elude us. Long ago, without your reaching to tell me, surely the plague killed you. Each thing in your life you found so incommensurate to the Spirit. I imagine that becoming untraceable makes you smile. Hunger for the absolute. When I met him, I knew I had weaned myself from God, not hunger for the absolute. Oh, unquenched mouth, tonguing what is and must remain inapprehensible, saying, you are not finite. You are not finite. Defrocked. Christ, the bridegroom, the briefly almost satiated soul, forever then, the bride. The true language of ecstasy is the forbidden language of the mystics. I am true love that false was never. I would be pierced, and I would pierce. I would eat, and I would be eaten. I am peace that is nowhere in time. Naked, their encounter with the absolute. Pilgrimage to a cross in the void. A journey you still must travel, for which you have no language, since you no longer believe it exists. When what we understand about what we are changes, whole parts of us fall mute. We have attached sensors to your most intimate body parts so that we may measure what you think, not what you think you think. The image now on the screen will circumvent your superego and directly stimulate your vagina or dick, or fail to. Writing has existed for centuries to tell us what you think you think. Liar. We are interested in what lies beneath that. This won't hurt. Even in lawless dreams, something each night in me again denies me the false coin, false creature I crave to embrace. For those milliseconds, not false, not false. Even if false, the waters of paradise are there in the mind, the sleeping mind. Why this Puritan, each night inside me that again denies me? Chimeras glitter, fierce energy you envy. Chimeras, ignorant their chimeras, beckon as you reach into their crotch. They foretell your fate with a sudden rush of milk. You taste what has no end. We long for the absolute, Royce said. Voices you once heard that you can never not hear again. Spoiled priest, liar. If you want something enough, sometimes you think it's there. Presage. Here at the rim of what has not yet been, the monotonous I want to die, sung over and over by your soul to your soul, just beneath sound, which you once again fail not to hear, fail to erase or obliterate, returns you to the mirror of itself. Mumps, meningitis, encephalitis, all at once together at age 8 or 9, or later at 13, salmonella, when the doctor said the next 2 days will decide if you live or die. You tried very calmly to ask yourself whether you did actually want to live. The answer you knew not clear. Then you heard something say, I want to live. Despite the metaphysical awfulness of this incontinent body shitting uncontrollably into a toilet in time, this place, this blind self, this family. Each time my sword descended, it did not cut, but renewed the Gordian knot. Dream of the book. That great hopefulness that lies in imagining you are an unreadable, not blank slate, but something even you cannot read, because words will rise from its depths only when you at last manage to expose it to air. The pathology of the provinces. You need air. Then you find air. Somehow, somewhere, as if whatever feeds expectation were wounded, gutted by the bewildering self-buried 1,000 impersonations by which you know you made and remade yourself. One day, staring at the mountain, you cease to ask, open sesame, merely requiring that narrative reveals something structural about the world. Reading history, you learn that those who cannot read history are condemned to repeat it, etc. Just like those who can or think they can. Substitute the psyche for history. Substitute myth for the psyche, economics for myth, substitute politics, culture, history, etc. As if there were a book. As if there were a book inside which you can breathe, where at every turn you see at last the lineaments, where the end of the earth's long dream of virtue is not, as you have again and again found it here, the will gazing out at the dilemmas proceeding from its own nature, unbroken, but in stasis. Seduced not by a book, but by the idea of a book. Like the Summa in 5 fat volumes. that your priest in high school explained Thomas Aquinas almost finished, except that there were, maddeningly, just a few things he didn't have time before dying quite to figure out. That history is a series of failed revelations. You're sure you hear folded, hidden within, the all but explicit bitter taste like dirt inside Dinah Washington's voice singing "This Bitter Earth." A few months before Thomas's death, as he talked with Jesus, Jesus asked him what reward he wanted for his virtue, to which Thomas replied, "You, Lord, only you." Which is why, as if this vision unfit him for his life, he told the priest prodding him to take up once again writing his book, "Reginald, I cannot. Everything I have written, I now see is straw." Though the book whose text articulates the text of creation is an arrogance, you think, flung by priests at all that is fecund, that has not yet found being. Though priests, addicted to unanswerable but necessary questions, also everywhere are addicted to cruel answers. You wake happy. When you dream, you have seen the book. The book exists. You sail protested, contested seas. There's something within you that chooses your masters, itself not chosen. Inheritor, inheriting, inheritors. You must earn what you inherit. Martha Yarnow's Bidart Hall. Though going crazy, she ate, as in Dante, your heart. Though 35 years after her death, her house, that she despised but spent her life constructing, still cannot be by your rage unmade. You think we had an encounter on the earth, each of us hungry beyond belief. As long as you are alive, she is alive. You are the leaping dog, capricious on the grass, lunging at something only it can see. O ruin, O haunted. O ruin, O haunted, restless remnant of two bodies, two histories, you felt the unceasing force of, but never understood. Terrified that without an X-ray, a topography of their souls, you must repeat their lives. You did not repeat their lives. You lodged your faith in art, which gives us pattern, process, with the flesh still stuck to it. With flesh, you told yourself pattern is truer, subtler, less given to the illusion seeing frees you from it. Or you repeated their lives by inverting them. How you hurtled yourself against, how cunningly you failed to elude love. Love is the manna that falling makes you see the desert surrounding you is a desert. Makes you think dirt is not where you were born. 6 more poems. Against rage. He had not been denied the world. Terrible scenes that he clung to because they taught him the world will at last be buried with him, as well as the exhilarations. Now he thinks each new one will be the last one. The last new page, the last sex. Each human being's story he tells nobody is a boat cutting through the night. As starless blackness approaches, the soul reverses itself in an eerie acceptance of finitude. Of his bones are coral made. He still trolled books, films, gossip, his own past, searching not just for ideas that dissect the mountain that is in his early old age he's almost convinced cannot be dissected. He searched for stories. Stories, the pattern of whose knot dimly traces the pattern of his own. What is intolerable in the world, which is to say intolerable in himself, ingested, digested. The stories that haunt each of us, for each of us, rip open the mountain. The creature smothered in death clothes, dragging into the forest bodies he killed to make meaning. The woman who found that she, to her bewilderment and horror, had a body. As if certain algae that keep islands of skeletons alive, that make living rock from trash, from carcasses left behind by others, as if algae were to produce out of themselves, and what they most fear, the detritus over whose kingdom they preside. The burning fountain is the imagination within us that ingests and by its devouring generates what is most antithetical to itself. It returns the intolerable as brilliant dream, visible, opaque, teasing analysis, makes from what you find hardest to swallow, most indigestible, your food. This is about the AIDS epidemic. It must be lifted from the mind. The plague you have thus far survived. They didn't. Nothing that they did in bed that you didn't. Writing a poem, I cleave to you. You means I. One you, as well as the you inside you constantly talk to. Without justice or logic, without sense, you survived. They didn't. Nothing that they did in bed that you didn't. For an unwritten opera. Once you had a secret love, seeing even his photo. A window is flung open high in the airless edifice that is you. Though everything looks as if it is continuing just as before, it is not. It is continuing in a new way. Sweet lingo, O'Hara and Ashbery teach. That's not how you naturally speak. You tell yourself first that he is not the air you need. Second, that you loathe air. As a boy, you despised the world for replacing God with another addiction, love. Despised yourself. Was there no third thing? But every blue moon, the skeptical, the adamantly disabused, find themselves like you, returned to life by a secret, like him in you. Now you understand Janacek at 70, in love with a much younger married woman, chastely writing her. As in Mozart, song remains, no matter how ordinary, how flawed the personae. For us poor mortals, private accommodations, magpie beauty. Last poem, Tyrant. In this journey through flesh, not just in flesh or with flesh, but through it, you drive forward, seeing in the rearview mirror, seeing only there, always growing smaller, what you drive toward. What you drive toward is what you once made with flesh. Out of stone caulked with blood, mortared with blood and flesh, you made a house, bright now in the rearview mirror, white in the coarse sun's coarse light. No more men died making it than any other ruthless monument. Living men admire. Now as your body betrays you, what you made with flesh is what you must drive toward. What you must, before you die, reassure, teach yourself you made. The house mortared with flesh, as if defying the hand of its maker. When you pull up to it at last, dissolves, as it is always dissolved. In this journey through flesh, not just in flesh or with flesh, but through flesh. Thank you.
I met Mary 9 years ago when I was her student in the master class here at Skidmore. We share a curiosity and love for Flannery O'Connor, and to be quite honest with you, I fell in love with Mary. About 6 years ago, I brought along a friend of mine to a book release party for one of Mary's new books. She's a big fan of Mary Gordon's work. And afterward, as we started the drive home, my friend turned to me and said, "Wow, Mary, she's so real, just like her characters." I love the truth in that, and the truth in the irony. As I read and reread Mary's body of work, this kept coming up, the cerebral ideas and premises fully clothed in the corporeal, the chaste and purity of the art, teasing the carnal desires. How is it that the narrator, the author, the characters, and the reader all inhabit her fiction and nonfiction as though a coterie? Since 1978, she's produced 7 novels, 2 memoirs, 2 essay collections, 2 short story collections, as well as Reading Jesus, a writer's encounter with the Gospels, a work of nonfiction, and a recent biography of Joan of Arc. Her writing does not exclude, there's no separation, no distance between the members of the coterie. The experience of reading Mary's work is like attending a 19th century salon. A string quartet plays in the background. Someone will read a bit of poetry. "I've invited Vuillard to join us this evening," the narrator says. What would it be like to attend, to be part of both the real and the imagined at a salon that Mary hosted? At once, Mary's paintbrush, also known as a waterman pen, pulls us in with an arm around our shoulder saying, "Come in, come in. Please remember, it's the questions that make true art." Across the room, we recognize Isabel from Mary's debut hit novel, Final Payments. Afresh in the world, Isabel asks, "Did everyone go on like that, doing things and then being surprised that others thought they had meaning? It was odd that your life could have more significance to other people than yourself. It was odd that other people understood what you did while you were simply going on and doing it." The further inside we travel, we feel a little less self-conscious among this venue filled with the greats. Jesus and Flannery O'Connor walk down the hall discussing the meaning of the epigram, "The violent bear it away." Flannery looks irritated as usual. We stop for a while in the front room, but if I hadn't, Joan of Arc is telling Pearl, the American student at Trinity on a hunger strike in the aftermath of the Irish peace agreement, we would have no Brie, no Monet, imagine a culture with only Turner. Mary, standing next to Joan, adds, "If a woman chooses to act rather than be looked at, if she wants scope and autonomy rather than the static fate of the regarded, even the well-regarded object, she becomes dangerous." Monica Szabo, the painter from Mary's novel Spending, steps up. "I hear voices too, Joan, a chaste older sister warning, 'Desire has weakened woman.' It says, it is only by denying our desire we have had what little place we have." Young Pearl nods in silent agreement, then shrugs as if to say, "Why choose to live at all?" Jesus arrives. "Puff pastry?" He holds out the hors d'oeuvres. We notice the man next to Monica has his hand on the small of her back. They both look mussed, as though they've just come from the bedroom, because we can smell the sex. Is that B? And later, we know they will bathe together, he washing her. So we make our way to the next room, past John Simon Guggenheim in the corner with Elliot Spitzer, O. Henry, and several others listing Mary's awards and accomplishments. Over there, those two folks look a little awkward, as though this isn't the kind of party they would normally have attended. We recognize them as Mary Gordon's own mother and father. Mother with one leg thinner and in a built-up boot, her father lounging on the couch. In The Shadow Man, the memoir of her father, Mary wrote, "My father died when I was 7 years old. I've always thought that was the most important thing anyone could know about me." But then she asks, "How can the glamorous father of my memory be a man who doesn't put his teeth in when he knows he's being photographed?" And in the memoir she wrote of her mother circling my mother, she reminds us to look for what Conrad calls that glimpse of truth for which we have forgotten to ask. She then begins to describe her mother using a description of Pierre Bonnard's painting, The Bathroom, to show an opposing view of her mother who has never taken a bath in her life, who couldn't get into a bathtub because of her lack of agility since being stricken with polio at the age of 3. Near the end of the book, Mary asks, how is it possible to speak of a mother's body, possible, that is, without betrayal? And if it is possible, is it permissible to speak of it as if it were not a body, but something that could be turned into a work of art? We pass by the kitchen and overhear Mary and Jesus in discussion. To bury the dead, she says, might be the most pure of all ethical acts because no reciprocity is possible. We continue down the hall of Mary's salon, wallowing in all these questions, this catechism. In one last room, we meet Miranda and Adam. In the novel In the Love of My Youth, Miranda has run into her childhood boyfriend Adam in Rome, and as they discover who they are now in their late 50s, we travel back to their days of first love, expectations, betrayals, dreams that no longer exist, and Miranda wonders, is this the most important thing that can be said about us, that we are not who we were? And in examining our lives, why is it there are some things we aren't meant to see? And there's Mary herself, in a gray wool dress, sleeveless, a jacket trimmed in Persian lamb, which she bought in Palm Springs. Around her neck is a black velvet and silk scarf with embossed flowers wound around her neck, the scarf that her character Jean-Claude obtained for free using the art of storytelling. New York Times critic Michiko Kakutani is fingering the scarf. Storytelling, Ms. Garden, as you suggest, is a way for people to make sense of their own lives and a way to connect to others. It's an art, as your work attests, an art you, Ms. Gordon, have ardently mastered yourself. The salon is winding down, dirty glasses and wads of napkins scattered on end tables. We say thank you and good night to Mary, although we know we'll be back, because like Mary, in the last line of her recent book, Reading Jesus, we are committed to the questions, unsusceptible to final answers. Will the real Mary Gordon please stand up?
Can you all hear me? Yes? It's wonderful to be back here. It makes me sad that I wasn't here for a year. And I miss being here. I miss my students and my friends, but here I am. So I decided, those of you who know me know that I'm not really great with machines. Machines don't like me. They want to punish me. I depress them and I cause them to commit suicide. And so this morning I had a printer problem, and while I was trying to fix my printer, I found a draft of what I thought was going to be a novella, which seems to be turning into a novel. And I was reading it and I thought, well, maybe I'll read that tonight. And so I decided that I'm going to take the risk, because this is a place I feel safe, of reading something really, really new. And this is what I thought was going to be a novella. It's turned into a novel. And let me explain the situation a little bit. It's really centered around the Spanish Civil War. And my character is now, one of my characters, who's called Marion, but to her granddaughter, Meme, is 92. She has a granddaughter who is 22. And the shape of the book is her trying to explain to her granddaughter what it was like to be 18 years old in 1936 and to go off and fight for the Republican cause, what that might have been like. That's sort of the shape of the book. This is the very beginning. The characters are Marion, the grandmother, who's 92. She's called Meme by her granddaughter, Amelia, who is 22. There are two other characters, Helga and Rosa. They are survivors of the Holocaust, 88 and 92. They're Marion's friends. They are lifelong lovers. And so we have four characters: Marion, the grandmother, also called Meme; Amelia, the granddaughter; Helga, and Rosa. I think that sort of describes it. So just remember, Marion is also Meme sometimes. Marion wouldn't hear a word against her granddaughter. She was fond of her daughter-in-law, but Natalie could be harsh. It was the other side of her remarkable gift for organization, the dark residue of the fuel that powered her accomplishments. When Natalie said to Marion, "Amelia's just so indecisive. It's not that she's lazy. No, I would never say that. It's that she lacks, well, I don't know quite what to call it, maybe force." And Marion had said, "Well, is it also wonderful where it's got us as a species? Force?" And Natalie had not, Marion knew, wanted to argue. If anyone had asked Amelia, and they often did, what exactly she was interested in, which meant what was she going to do with her life, when was she going to settle down and have a real job, and preferably a real profession, she never said what she really meant. "I'm interested in decoration," because she knew if she had said that, she'd be misunderstood. They'd think she wanted to fix up rooms, the look of a house, matching drapes and slipcovers, finding the right sofa, the right lamp. But what she really liked was just adding little decorative touches. She didn't want to make things. She thought there were already too many things in the world. The world didn't need new things. It was perhaps because of her father, her very beloved father, who had died gently as he had lived, as if his life were something he had just slipped into an envelope and sent somewhere. but somewhere Amelia had no way of reaching. Her father, who stayed at home with her while her mother was out saving many cities. Her father, the potter, whose relationship to his work filled Amelia with an abiding and protective sadness. He made things that people didn't want. His studio was overcrowded, overfull, with pots, vases, plates that he brought to craft fairs and flea markets, Amelia always accompanying him, taking the money for the purchases that were far more rare than she hoped and prayed for. She would leave each craft fair, each flea market saddened, shamed for herself rather than her father, her beautiful, gentle father, to whom it never seemed to occur to be ashamed or sad. Whistling, making up songs as he repacked the pots, the vases, the plates, each carefully, each like a loved young animal, and lifted the heavy crates into the van, and not seeing the disappointment in her mother's face when she asked, "Had a good day?" and her father's reply always the same, "Good enough." Focusing on the wonderful conversations he had with the one or two who bought a vase or a pitcher. Amelia always wondered whether they bought because they liked the work or because her father was so handsome, had a smile so radiant that you simply wanted to be around it because it convinced you of the goodness of the world, and because she knew people were touched by the father and his young daughter who looked so much alike, who knew she had the same powerful smile, the smile that could make people do things, or she had learned over the years that that smile used a certain way could prevent people doing things the way they originally thought they had to do. Even now, she wouldn't ask herself if the things her father made were good, were beautiful, because what would be the opposite of good and beautiful? Bad? Ugly? There was no point in thinking that way. She did know that the crowdedness of the world disturbed her. That was something she had learned not only from her father, but her mother. In her father's studio, she saw the stacked, unwanted objects at her mother's hands. Buildings were torn down and others were put up. It seemed wrong to her to devote any love or hope to things that were meant to last. Either they lasted too long or not nearly long enough. Either they were unloved, ignored, unchosen, or pulled down for reasons that sometimes made some sense and sometimes not at all. Marion knew that when she was younger, Natalie's age, 57, she might have been impatient with Amelia or someone like her, but now she was 92. One of the things she knew about herself over the years, she had got kinder. And it wasn't true entirely that Amelia lacked force. You just had to look at the word force differently. Certainly, she had been forceful when Marion needed her support, standing up to those villains who wanted to destroy the swans. When Amelia thought of that day, the day she called in her mind the day of the swans, she knew that the beginning of the afternoon suggested nothing that was to follow. It was late March, the 25th, one of the first days that could be properly called spring. It was late afternoon. The sky was bluish-violet. Smoky clouds, thin as eyebrows, dissipated in the pastel air. The air still had a chill in it, like a glass of ice water with the ice just taken out, Meme had said. It's my favorite kind of weather, the very beginning of spring when it still might be the end of winter, because nothing has started to be finished yet, because it hasn't really begun. And Amelia had thought, whatever happens to me, I am descended from someone who says things like that. It had been a hard winter, and the three women who walked were old. Rosa, the youngest, was 88. Rosa, Helga, and her grandmother had not been outside much, and for Helga and Meme this was a trial. Like dogs leashed almost beyond their endurance, they burst out of the car when Amelia pulled into the parking lot at the beach. They would walk by the ocean, three old women and Amelia. They broke into two couples, the real couple, Helga and Rosa, splitting up because Maymay and Helga liked walking more quickly than Rosa, and silently they had agreed to leave her in Amelia's care. Rosa leaned heavily at first and then more lightly on Amelia's arm. Amelia worried that the dunes, made higher because of the winter windstorms, would be more difficult than Rosa could bear, and she was ready to suggest the gentler, flatter walk, passing by the bay, missing the dramatic ocean view. But Rosa made her way, slowly, deliberately, up the sandy hill. Walking up the dune, they seemed, Amelia thought, to have entered a new climate. Was it the exertion of the climb or the dunes sheltering? But it seemed to Amelia that the chill in the air that her grandmother had remarked on had disappeared. The air took on a kind of sultriness, and suddenly there was a suggestion of fog about to come. The sky grew smokier, pink shone behind the graying clouds, and as if it were another sky entirely. To the west, it was silvery, and there was a hole in the clouds, as if the sun had burnt it through. She was watching her grandmother's back, and the back of her grandmother's beloved friend. They were quite a ways ahead, and had she not known them, their identities would be unclear. They seemed to her not quite real, characters from a story, figures in an illustration from a children's book of fairy tales. The vagueness, the distance, saturated everything with a yearning tenderness. Distance was not a threat, a sign of separateness, rather a suggestion that nothing was impossible. There was no sense of far, rather of a separation that could be easily bridged. There was nothing that could not be swum to, without strain, without a fear of drowning. She looked out over the inlet at the islands that made a gap through which, in high season, dark boats sailed. But there were no boats now, only the sense of opening, of an entirely desirable invisibility. Despite the sweat that started traveling down her spine, she knew that it was winter. The beach grasses were dry. The branches of the squat beach rose bushes showed uncomfortable-looking prickles that you knew would pierce your skin. You wanted to stay far from them. The conifers were rusty, off balance from the winter winds. She could hear the water, but the landscape seemed more desert than seacoast. Having grown up in California, a seasonless country, she never quite believed in seasonality, that it might be predictable, that there were patterns that might recur. Why should she believe that by June the roses would be pink, the grasses lush and green, then a metallic silver when the sun caught the drops of spray on their new graceful curves? Now everything was dormant, and she found the dormancy restful. Nothing was being used. The only visible boat had been abandoned. It was a hull only, on its side, tied to a rock against a shore. She could not believe that anyone would ever come for it, that it would ever sail again. The fog thickened, and Helga and her grandmother disappeared over the dune. They too had become invisible. She could hear the sound of bells. She often heard them here, but she never could remember what their source was. She knew that she had asked her grandmother, and her grandmother had told her, but it was the kind of thing she couldn't keep in her mind, and after a while she was embarrassed to keep asking. Boom, boom, boom went the bells, a reminder of something benevolent. Somewhere there was protection, rescue. At the top of the dune, they stopped for a moment's rest. Amelia looked out to the inlet, the gaps between the islands. She never knew what the islands were, if anyone lived there, what they were called. The separation opened up into an unknown destination, but the unknown, rather than being frightening, seemed to offer a possibility, not dramatic, not exciting, but leading to something whose rightness she could not sense but name. She could sense but not name. Maymay will go there, she thought. Someday I will lose sight of her, as I have lost sight of her on the far side of the dune. She will be sailing somewhere off, far off, to a place that I can't follow. I must believe she will be happy. I must believe it will be all right. Tears came to her eyes, and the islands blurred. They came together in her vision and then separated. Rosa saw her tears and leaned more closely into Amelia's body. She too seemed to be weeping, and the tears were pleasurable to them both, coming easily, releasing something into the dim air. The wind picked up. She saw that Helga and her grandmother crossed over the dune to the more sheltered part of the beach. The water here was nearly waveless. Some fretful ripples ruffled the surface, but near the shore there were pools of calmness, and in them pastel reflections, blue, pink, violet, girlish colors. She looked at Rosa, her thin hair in its chignon, her rose-colored scarf, her pinkish lipstick, her sunglasses, their rims a violet blue. She's still girlish, Amelia thought, at 88. And I am probably in their minds still a girl, perhaps even in my own mind. She wondered when she would no longer think of the word girl in relation to herself. The women decided it had become too difficult to walk on the sand, and they decided to continue their walk on the road next to the lagoon. Amelia and her grandmother, and Helga and Rosa, two couples, May with her arm linked through Amelia's, Rosa with hers in Helga's, and they couldn't make sense of what they saw. At first, they found it comical, a man standing in a canoe, wielding a paddle against a swan, flapping its wings with real aggressive intent. Everyone knew that swans could be dangerous. Someone had said something about a child in Watch Hill having his arm broken when he got too near a swan. Marion had not believed it, but there was no denying the swan's intent to hurt or to protect. And they stood immobile, trying to understand, trying to decide what should be done. Eventually the swan flew off and settled in the water, abashed, ashamed. The women waited for the man to come near so they could speak to him. "Whatever are you doing?" Marion asked. She had never lost the privileged timbre of her voice, the voice that assumed without question that she would be listened to. She believed she had got rid of her aristocratic mid-Atlantic accent, and if you told her she hadn't, she'd be furious. The young man took his cap off. Amelia thought he might be ready to bow. "It's an environmental project, ma'am. The mute swans here are overpopulating, and they're a threat to the native species, like the wild geese. And they're overeating the various flora, so they're starving out several other species as well. They're upsetting the ecological balance. They're not native swans, they were imported when this place was first turned into a resort. And they're very clever swans. They're very cunning. They've pushed out all the natives." "And what is it that you're doing with that paddle?" Marion went on. "Well, we're approaching the nests so we can addle the eggs." "I don't understand," Helga said. "Well, ma'am, if we can get to the eggs and just shake them a little, or sometimes coat them with mineral oil, or just puncture the shells with a pinhole, the mother will still sit on them, but they won't hatch. This controls the population without any harm to the adults. They only lay eggs once a year, and so if you control the eggs for 1 year, well, you've controlled the population." "Control," Helga said. "Oh, yes, your kind is very fond of control." Rosa stood behind her. She seemed frightened. Amelia was afraid she was going to begin to cry. "Control usually means the use of some sort of violence against a weaker creature," Marion said. "I would say your brandishing a paddle is an example of that." "Ma'am, I'm a wildlife specialist. I've devoted my life to birds. I don't do this work so I can hurt them." "And yet you are," Marion said. "It's a controversial enterprise," the young man said. "You're welcome to come over to our headquarters and read our literature." Amelia looked at the young man. He was blushing. He was beginning to stammer. Amelia felt sorry for him. She felt sorry for the swan, looking so abashed, so ashamed. She was worried for Rosa. She was worried for the Canada geese, whose flight she loved to watch, their strong V's, such a sign of ardent, steadfast progress. She liked what she had heard about them, that the flock had leaders only by turns, that the lead bird, the one at the narrow point of the V, only led till she was tired, and then she was easily replaced. But she liked what she heard about swans, too, that they were monogamous, that the males were involved in the incubation and rearing of the young. She wished that they had never come by this place, that they had walked somewhere else or at some other time. But she knew what her grandmother would say: "You can't pretend not to see what you've seen." She remembered something else she'd seen, a swan, dead at the shore, stretched out, its whiteness sullied by the sand, its neck no longer beautiful in its length, but snake-like, and in its deadness, not suggesting dance or flight, but a clumsy excess, an asymmetry, a grotesque imbalance. Its beak was orange and ugly. Its black eye stared, accusing, stupid. She wanted a wave to come and take the bird away, out of her sight. And she didn't know what would come next now, on this day, but she knew that Helga and her grandmother wouldn't let go of it until something had happened, until they had made their mark. Meme was all for driving immediately to the Wildlife Center at Kettle Pond to protest in person what they'd seen. Helga said they'd be better off doing their homework, which means they would need Amelia's help. Meme and Helga were easily frustrated on the computer, and Rosa had never even turned one on. They would spend some days at the library first, days they loved, punctuated by a lunch of sandwiches eaten by the canal. A week later, Helga had organized a thick folder of articles. She was spreading it out on the table. Rosa had just made a leek and potato soup. They would eat it for supper with brown bread and manchego. Rosa didn't sit with Marion and Helga at the table. She brought things back and forth from the kitchen, and Amelia stood at the stove, stirring zabaglione, which she would serve with raspberries Helga had frozen the summer before. How to think about this, Helga said, without being sentimental. The damn swans, all that damn romance around them, all that encrusting of the dim romantic past. Amelia heard a crash, and then a scuffling of chairs, and then the sound of weeping. Don't you hear it? Don't you hear what they're saying about the swans? Doesn't remind you of what they said about us, about who I am? Don't you remember when I danced the swan, and then we had to flee, and then they wanted to destroy me, they wanted to destroy us all? It was the same things. They said the same things about us. We were foreigners, we were clever, we were exotic, we were stealing the proper birthright of the natives. Amelia had seen it before. Rosa's terrible past could descend on her, crashing around her, and she would be lacerated by the shards. And Helga, whose life had been devoted to protecting her, she had saved her life, and time after time had sustained it, said something in German that Amelia didn't understand. They hate the beautiful, Rosa said. The brutes of the world hate what is beautiful, what they cannot buy or sell or put to use. And Marion stood up. Well then, my dear, we're not going to let them, honey, are we? We're going to keep those beautiful birds safe. And so it began. They're organizing their friends, the signs, the picketing of the nature sanctuary, contacting the local newspapers, the local televisions, the 3 old women carrying the beautiful posters Rosa had made, shaking their fists and shouting, "Save the swans." Amelia felt sorry for the workers at the wildlife sanctuary. Against the striking old women, they could only seem coarse and callous. Amelia had grown fond of the young man, Scott Riccardi, who lisped and blushed when the microphone was put in front of him. She thought he had a point. She thought the women had a point. She didn't know what she believed was right. Only she knew she would stand beside her grandmother. And one night, she expressed her disquiet, one of those nights when the moon was the size of a fingernail in the black sky, and the first warmth made you foolishly open the window. And Meme had said, "Of course I know what you mean, but I learned a very long time ago that if you wait for the perfect action, you will never act. In a situation like this, all you can do is the least bad thing, and be truthful about the cost of what you've done, about the losses that you've brought about, for which you must always understand you also are responsible. And besides that, ideas aren't things that float in the air, they're connected to people. So for Rosa, there is no question. The swans are the swans, and they represent the whole of her past to her, what was destroyed, what she lost. Therefore, the sides are no longer equal because someone I love weighs on one side." Amelia sat on the floor in front of her grandmother, who was sitting on the couch. She put her head in her grandmother's lap, and she thought, I will never be as good as you. I will never, ever be what you are. I will never be as wise. I will never be as courageous. I may never, ever be anything but some version of a child. But to her grandmother she said, "Oh, May, I want to be like you someday." And her grandmother said, "Nonsense. You don't want to live the way I've lived. You don't want to have made the same mistakes that I've made. You don't want to do the harm that I have done." "Harm?" Amelia said. "That's for another day," May said. "For now, I'm quite tired." Thank you.